As you know, whenever the second day of a Yom Tov falls out on Shabbos, as it was like Shavuos and Chutz La'aretz, so there's going to be a disconnect or a difference in what is the parsha of the week. So, for example, in Eretz Yisrael, Shavuos was last Friday. Shabbos was not Yom Tov anymore, so we read the parsha of the week, which is Parshas Naso. But in Chutz La'aretz, it was the second day of Shavuos, so you read the Yom Tov reading, and this week is Parshas Naso, which means Eretz Yisrael is 1 week ahead of Chutz La'aretz. So if you're traveling back and forth, if you're an Israeli, you might hear the same parsha twice. If you're a Chutz La'aretz person who comes to Israel, you might miss a parsha. So there's all sorts of different questions. How do you adjust it? Eventually, we do catch up. Not we, we're the right place, but Chutz La'aretz catches up because at the end of Bamidbar, they're going to read a double parsha. We're only going to read them as separate parshios, so there'll be a catch up. Why we have to wait that long is actually a bit of a mystery, because why don't you fix it now? Why do you wait several weeks? But just warning people who are tourists going back and forth in one direction or the other, that there is going to be a bit of a problem in terms of the Kriyas HaTorah. Now, the truth is, some poskim say that's not really your problem. Basically, you listen to the laning of wherever you happen to be, and that's perfectly fine. The fact that you missed a parsha is not really your problem. There's a chiyuv on the community to finish the Torah the whole year, and you as an individual are supposed to hear the Torah reading on Shabbos, but it doesn't have to be that you heard every parsha. In other words, you have to hear every Shabbos, but you don't have to hear every parsha. Meaning, if you go to shul on Shabbos and you heard a Torah reading, the fact that in the course of the year there was a parsha you didn't hear, but you were in shul and there was a Kriyas HaTorah, so Rav Moshe Feinstein actually says it's not a problem. Others do require some type of catch-up procedure. But be it as it may, with apologies to the people in Chutz La'aretz, I am going to talk about Baloscha, which is the parsha of the week here in Eretz Yisrael. And it's very interesting that the Levim are set aside to assist the Kohanim in their service, and the Levim have a number of distinct jobs. Some of the jobs carried over to when we had a Beis HaMikdash. Some of the jobs are only during the desert. So, for example, the job of the Levim to disassemble, transport, and reassemble, that was ephemeral. That only applied during the 40 years in the desert. Once we come to Eretz Yisrael, and we have initially a place in Shiloh, and then the Beis HaMikdash is not going to be transported anymore, right? So the transportation function, which the Torah does make a very big deal of, that is only for the Midbar. But then the Levim have other functions that carry over from the Mishkan to the Beis HaMikdash. One is the concept of song, that when korbanos were brought, and only the Kohanim bring the korbanos. Levim do not Levim do not do the service of the korbanos, but the Levim stand on a platform, and they have both vocal music, they sing, and there's actually instrumental music that's played, and that's even on Shabbos. In fact, one of the reasons why the Reform synagogues were called temples, because the very first Reform innovation, meaning some of them were actually fairly orthodox, but they had a particular innovation in the beginning of the 1800s, is they introduced an organ, or the playing of musical instruments. And initially, later they didn't use halachic justifications, but in the very, very early years of Reform, they tried to justify their innovations by halachic argumentation. And they basically said, since a synagogue is called a miniature Beis HaMikdash, and in the Beis HaMikdash they played musical instruments even on Shabbos, which is true, so therefore you're allowed to play musical instruments in a synagogue, and hence they appropriated the term temple to kind of underscore the justification for an organ. Now, in truth, even within the Reform movement, some synagogues were more religious than others. Some synagogues would only use a non-Jewish organist. And if you want to know the truth, it's not 100% clear that even would be forbidden. I mean, there may be a halachic justification, at least for an non-Jew. But okay, I don't want to get into that halacha. So, but be it as it may, the Levim were both musicians and singers. It is very, very unfortunate that we seem not to have any record of the music that was actually sung. We know that later the lyrics were Tehillim, although that may not have been the case in Moshe Rabbeinu's time. The Tehillim weren't written yet. But we don't really know the tunes. Ancient music anyway is very, very difficult to reconstruct because we simply don't have the notation system. Now we do have, of course, in Tanakh and in Tehillim, what's called trup. We do have the tamim, which are musical notations, but those are musical notations in your reading and in your study. They do not refer to how it was sung in the Beis HaMikdash. Some have speculated, and I'm not sure there's any proof for this, that the Gregorian chants may have been somehow connected to the Levite music in the temple. The Gregorian chants are very, very old. They originate from Rome. Now remember, the Romans destroyed the Second Temple in the year 70, and we know that they carried artifacts of the Second Temple back to Rome. That's the famous Arch of Titus, which depicts the Jews in chains carrying the captured menorah and bringing it to Rome. In fact, I don't know if any of you have ever visited Rome, but there's an old Jewish tradition that we don't even walk under the Arch of Titus. We don't want to give any honor to that monument to the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash and the plundering of the Jewish people. So some have suggested that when the Romans plundered the Beis HaMikdash and they brought many, many Jews to Rome as slaves, some of the music was brought there as well, which eventually infiltrated the Catholic Church. Others have said there's no proof for that. The Gregorian chants are old, but they might date only from the 7th century, from the 600s, which is way after, hundreds of years after the Beis HaMikdash. So who knows? I don't know. But it is indeed a chaval that we don't really have any record of the music of the Beis HaMikdash. But the fact that music was such an important part of the service in the temple highlights the idea that music is extremely important in avodas Hashem, in divine service. We find particularly in Kabbalah that the heavenly gates of music are next to the gates of Torah and next to the gates of Tshuva, because all of these things can bring a person to the very, very highest spiritual levels. Some say nigunim without words are even more powerful than nigunim with words, just the pure music itself. And this gets into an issue which I don't really want to discuss. And that is the issue of listening to music from impure sources. Like some people take the position, which is a defensible position, that music is a neutral medium. So even if some degenerate guy, writes music, if you like the music and you listen to it, it doesn't affect you in a negative way. At least the tune. Kabbalistically, that's not really so. Kabbalistically, it is said that either the composer or maybe the performer, that's also a shaila, kind of puts into the music their nature, and their nature can affect you in negative ways. Okay, so this is a whole interesting discussion, but it does underscore the power of music. Music is extremely, extremely powerful. Okay. And so again, the Levim had the disassembly, transportation, reassembly function of the Mishkan, which is only in the desert. They had the avoda of shira, of song and music, and that applied even in the Beis HaMikdash, and that will apply liyasid lavo in the Beis HaMikdash. They also had what you might call guard functions, that they were in charge of opening and closing the gates and being sure that unauthorized entries don't occur, like non-Kohanim entering the Mikdash, etc. So they, because indeed, if you look at Parshas Korach, we're going to read in a few weeks, you see this idea that if the Jewish people break the boundaries of unauthorized people doing divine service, that brings the wrath of God on the congregation. And it's the Levim's job to prevent that wrath of Hashem from coming down. Right? So Levim, the very word Levi means accompaniment, and the Torah uses it to mean the Levi is the accompaniment of the Kohen, as the Kohen does his service. Many of you might know, I don't know if you noticed, that here in Eretz Yisrael, the Kohanim recite the priestly blessing every day. Unlike Chutz La'aretz that only does it, for Ashkenazim at least, only does it on Yom Tov. So before a Kohen duchens, before a Kohen blesses the people, the Kohen's hands must be washed. And who washes the hands? The Kohen doesn't wash his own hands, ideally. Levim. I suppose. So one of the jobs of a Levi is to wash the hands of the Kohen before he goes up to the blessing. In fact, I still remember, it was so interesting. My own Rosh Yeshiva at Ner Yisrael in Baltimore was Rav Yaakov Ruderman, who was really one of the great Gedolim of the 20th century. And because he was a Levi, Rav Yaakov Yitzchak HaLevi. So I remember we used to talk, like it was almost like in almost a hushed tone, that when it was time for Kohanim to duchen on Yom Tov in Chutz La'aretz, there was a certain boy who was an exceptionally brilliant student that the Rosh Yeshiva himself would wash his hands, and that was like the ultimate glory. Wow, he's so esteemed that the Rosh Yeshiva himself would wash his hands. We would talk about that a lot. But be it as it may, this is where the Levi, even the great Rosh Yeshiva, has to serve the Kohen, even if it's a Bachar. But again, Rav Ritterman only chose the best Bachar to wash his hands. Okay. Now, what's interesting about Levim is Levim seem to have a mandatory retirement age. It's very, very interesting. The Torah says a Levi does not begin, first of all, there's a start point also. A Levi does not begin his service until he reaches the age of 30. And he retires from his service at the age of 50. 30 to 50. 50 is a pretty young retirement age. Certainly from my vantage point, it's certainly real young. 50 is a kid, right? People used to say, there was a saying in the 1960s with the hippies, Abby Hoffman, you can't trust anybody over 30. They're already dead when they're 30, right? That's what they said. But 50 is indeed a young retirement age. Now, there's an interesting paradox here. There is no retirement age for a Kohen. A Kohen can do the avoda as long as he's physically able until he's 110. There is only a retirement age for a Levi, and there's no retirement age for a Kohen. Conversely, let's look at something. So age is a limitation on Levi and not Kohen. But there's something that's a limitation on Kohen that's not Levi, and that is physical blemish. A Kohen with a broken leg, even if he could do the service, is pasul. This is called a mum. Mum is only a psul for a Kohen. It's not a psul for a Levi. So we're going to explore this a little bit. So again, Kohanim are disqualified by blemishes and not by age. Levim are disqualified by age and not by blemishes. Meaning the very same thing that's no good for a Kohen is good by a Levi, and the very thing that's no good for a Levi is good for a Kohen. Opposite requirements. Okay, so we'll try to explain the significance of that. But let's first talk about the retirement age. So, first of all, what is the starting age? So I said 30. So Rashi brings a contradiction on the starting age. Because one pasuk says the starting age is 30. Another pasuk says the starting age is 25. So you've got a 5-year difference on the starting age. So Rashi explains that there's a 5-year training and apprenticeship program. So you start the apprenticeship. It's not clear exactly what that means. I don't have an absolute description of it, but you start the apprenticeship at 25, and then at 30 you graduate to full-fledged service. That's how Rashi reconciles the contradiction. And here Rashi brings a very interesting Gemara in Chulin, that if the Torah gives a 5-year apprenticeship, we derive the following principle: that if you're pursuing a career or an activity for 5 years, and after 5 years you have not achieved success, it's time to move on to something else. Because the Torah says after 5 years you ought to be ready by a Levi. If you're not ready, this is not the right line of work. So many people who are in yeshiva, let's say for a few years, they want to move on, they want to get out, because they say, I've been here 5 years and I'm not successful, got to go out. So there are two answers to that. Sometimes people want to keep you in yeshiva. I don't want to scare you, but they're saying, okay, learn more. So there are two answers that Rebbeim give to the argument, I've been here 5 years and I'm not successful. One answer we'll call the tough love answer, and the other answer is the warm and fuzzy answer. The tough love answer says, hey, the 5 years only counts if you've been working to try to achieve success. What you've been doing, call that working? In other words, the clock hasn't started yet. You got to give it 5 years of concerted effort. You didn't start. Okay, that's the tough love answer. The warm and fuzzy answer is 5 years without success. Who says you haven't achieved success? Now, maybe you haven't achieved the success that you hoped you would achieve or that you should have achieved. But hey, when you came here, maybe you couldn't read Hebrew, now you can read Hebrew. When you came here, you never knew a Rashi, now you know a Rashi. When you came here, you never learned a Mishnah, now you learned a Mishnah. Success. Success doesn't mean you're the Chafetz Chaim or Rabbi Akiva, but you achieve success, right? And that's an important idea, that don't devalue the successes that you do achieve, even if you might think they're not so significant or whatever it is. They are significant, and they do represent real milestones. Of course, you try to do better, we try to grow, we try to improve, but do not diminish, do not devalue the successes. Okay, so that answers the contradiction between the 25 and the 30. Now, the upper limit is 50, and that there's no machlokas. 50, and you're out. You are disqualified. Now, here, though, there's a very, very fascinating, it's more complicated than you think. There's a very fascinating machlokas, Rashi and Ramban, ultimately based on conflicting midrashim. What are you disqualified from? Because Levim have many, many functions. Is this a total disqualification at 50? Or so Rashi seems to say that the disqualification is actually very, very limited. Even after 50, you can still sing. So in the Beis HaMikdash, essentially, that was the main job. Right? You can have right? They have singers who are like in their 80s, they can still sing, okay? And even after 80, I'm sorry, not after 80, even after 50, you're able to load the wagons. Remember, there are three subgroups of Levi. Gershon handled the tapestries and cloths that they would load onto wagons. Merari handled the heavy beams that they would load onto wagons. But Kahas carried on the shoulders the Aron, the Mizbeach, the Menorah, the Shulchan. And because of the sanctity of these objects, they carried it on their shoulders, they did not use wagons. So according to Rashi, the mandatory retirement is only on those things which have to be physically carried. In other words, b'nei kahas. And at that point, according to Rashi, the age of 50 seems to simply be connected to physical strength. I mean, that seems to be the point. The point is, we don't want 50-year-olds to be carrying the Aron HaKodesh because, God forbid, they might drop it or whatever it will be. In other words, anything that does not involve physically carrying the objects, according to Rashi, there's no mandatory retirement at all. So even if you're 50 or 60 or 70, you can sing, you can even load the wagons, but you cannot do avoda bakasef. Avoda bakasef is the carrying on the shoulders. Now, I do have a big kasha on that, because we find in Parshas Bamidbar that all of the Levim were counted from the age of 30. Oh, that's the okay. I was going to say that if the retirement age didn't apply to most of the Levim, then why are we counting from 30? But that's not an issue. The starting point is going to be the same for everybody. It's the ending point that's going to be different. So according to Rashi, it would appear that the mandatory retirement of 50 is simply the idea that your physical strength, obviously there's going to be exceptions, but as a general rule, your physical strength might begin to decline a little bit. I hope that doesn't depress you too much. Ramban, on the other hand, takes it much further. According to Ramban, it is not only a disqualification for avoda bakasef, it is also a disqualification for shira. That's a biggie. According to Ramban, once a Levi hits the age of 50, he is no longer eligible to sing in the Beis HaMikdash, no matter how beautiful his voice is. He can still load the wagons and open and close the gates, even like according to the Ramban. So, like Rashi, who disqualifies the 50-year-old only from shoulder carrying, the issue is simply a matter of strength. But like Ramban, that this is extended to even Shira, why would that be so? Like, why would I disqualify somebody at 50 from singing in the Beis HaMikdash? The issue is not physical strength at that point. So here is the deeper thought that explains the idea and also the difference in the Kohen and the Levi. Why is a Kohen not disqualified by age, but is disqualified by mum? And a Levi is disqualified by age and not by mum. The Kohen and the Levi represent two different aspects in Avodas Hashem. The Kohen represents precise adherence to ritual. In the avoda of a Kohen, there is no room for improvisation, for creativity, for individuality. You gotta follow the book. Anyone that studies the laws of Korbanos, whether it's in Chumash or Mishnah or Gemara, sees how precise and exact the ritual must be. Any deviation from the exact sequence can render the whole korban puzzle. To give you one little example, a Kohen must do the avoda of korbanos wearing the priestly garments. If he's not wearing the priestly garments, the avoda is no good. Well, what if he's wearing his standard uniform, but he decided to decorate himself a little bit more with a beautiful multicolored scarf or necktie? You might think that's a harmless little adornment. In point of fact, that is called doing the avodah with an extra garment. And that puzzles the whole korbanos. It's puzzle. The avodah is puzzle because the same way if he's lacking the priestly garments, the avodah is puzzle. If he has an extra garment, the avodah is puzzle. So the Kohen represents what you might call, to use a term of Rabbi Soloveitchik, halachic man. Follow the rules. Don't deviate. Be very, very, very exact. The world of the Levi is a very different type of world. Because if the Levi's main avoda is song and music, the Torah does not prescribe. The Torah does not prescribe the music, what the music is. The Torah does not prescribe what the words are either. So eventually the words became standardized Tehillim, that's true. But as far as the Torah is concerned, this was creative. This was spontaneous. This was improv. The world of the Levi is the world of emotion, the world of feeling, the world of creativity, the world of spontaneity. The role of the Kohen is predictability, stability, adherence to rule. Now, in truth, each of these modalities of divine service has its strengths and has its weaknesses. The idea of following the rules is very, very important in Judaism. A lot of times people say, oh, I'm spiritual. The most important thing is my relationship with God. Does God care if I turn on a light switch or I rip some toilet paper in the bathroom? Are you telling me that that affects my relationship with Hashem? The main point is the spirituality. Well, the truth is, Hashem defines how we relate to Him. And all of these rules, even if they don't necessarily appear that logical to us, they are the conditions of the relationship. So the Kohen represents, I do the will of God. I don't serve God based on my feelings, based on my ups, based on my downs. I do what is right because it has to be right. So the Kohen represents the idea of faithfulness, dependability, and stability, in which your connection to Hashem does not fluctuate based on your emotions. There's a constancy. That's the upside. The downside is that sometimes it becomes so routinized and so habitual that you don't bring a feeling and a passion to it. So the upside is stability and consistency. The downside might be complacency and, God forbid, even boredom. Now, the world of the Levi is filled with rich emotion and creativity. Obviously, the passion is there. But here's the thing. When your avoda is motivated by your emotional state, emotions do come and go. And there are times you're not going to be inspired. And a person might say, oh, if I'm not inspired, I'm going to skip davening today. See, the Kohen is not going to skip davening when he's not inspired. He says, this is my job. Got to do my job. The Levi, I don't mean an actual Levi, but the modality of the Levi might be, I'm not inspired today, so let's skip it. You see? You know, I remember when I was a Rav in Silver Spring. So we had a member of our show who has since passed away. He was already in his 80s when I was still there. And he did not go to yeshiva. He grew up in America at a time when there weren't any yeshivas. So he didn't go to yeshiva at all. But he was from his whole life, in spite of the fact, I believe, he never really told us. I believe he actually worked for the CIA years before. But you would be unbelievable. You would not. He was like the most soft-spoken person. But I can tell you that the concept of his missing a minyan because of weather was just It was just impossible. I mean, I remember he was like 85 years old. There was too much snow on the ground to drive safely, so he would be walking through the snow to get to shul. Okay, he didn't live that far, but still, it was 3 blocks, and See, if you're more sophisticated, you're more learned, so you start making arguments. Well, halachically, I'm not mechuya. This is where sometimes our learning gets in the way, because we can justify almost everything in various ways. He had no justifications. He had a job, and this was his job, and he did his job no matter what, day in, day out, day in, day out. The Levi, on the other hand, sometimes you're going to be inspired, which is wonderful, but other times you're not inspired. Where do you go when you're not inspired? So that's where you need the Kohen. So the truth is, in Avodas Hashem, you actually need both modalities. But now let's explain this. If you look at the Kohen as consistency, stability, predictability, there is no reason to disqualify him based on age. Because if anything, the longer he's been in the routine, the more natural it is to stick with it. So if the Kohen is doing it at 50, he can do it at 60, do it at 70, do it at 80, because this is his routine. The only thing that could stop him is physical disability. At some point, he physically is not able to do it. That's mum. So the Kohen does not get disqualified by age. He gets disqualified by physical disability. With the Levi, it's the other way around. Because the Levi is motivated by powerful emotion, you know that powerful emotion can actually transcend physical limitations. Now, again, you might be thinking of the Christian faith healers when the minister calls out to the person in the wheelchair, get up, get up. And the guy gets up. Okay, most of the time that's fake. But there actually is such a phenomenon, that intense emotional feeling can sometimes transcend physical limitations. An example is, in a negative way, you have these stories, and these stories are true, in which a child gets trapped under a car, and the mother lifts up the car. These are actually, the emotion is so overwhelmingly powerful that she gets strength beyond her abilities. And then, she might be in the hospital for the next 6 months. But for that second, yeah. So, the Levi is not disqualified by mum, because the power of emotion can allow him to transcend his physical limitation. So what is the danger that a Levi faces? Over-habituation, meaning the very over-habituation that makes the Kohen more settled in his routine could sap the Levi of his creative passion. So as he's doing the job longer and longer and longer and longer, the excitement may be less. So that's why he's disqualified by years. Because a Levi can't just be doing the same thing over and over again. There has to be a sense of renewal. You see? So habituation is the ally of the Kohen and the enemy of the Levi. Physical disability is the enemy of the Kohen, but the Levi is able to transcend it to some degree. Okay? This kind of explains the dichotomy. Now, obviously, the Kuzari writes that every human being is essentially a tabernacle, a Beis HaMikdash dedicated to God. Right? I know you've heard the song, and there are svarim written with this phrase, Bilvavi Mishkan Evnech. I will build a sanctuary for God in my heart. Bilvavi Mishkan Evnech. So we are a Mishkan, because what does the word Mishkan mean? I mean tabernacle. What does tabernacle mean? Mishkan means a dwelling place. So when you say you make yourself a Mishkan, what does that mean? I make myself a dwelling place for the divine presence. Now, the same way, the Mishkan needs both Kohanim and Levim. The Mishkan I build in my heart needs Kohanim and Levim. Meaning, I got to combine, we have to combine the Kohen and the Levi. On one hand, we have to be like the Kohen. Follow the rules. Keep the halacha. Don't improvise your own modalities of spirituality. Follow the way that God told you to follow. In fact, the very word halacha means pathway. Hashem gave us a pathway. But at the same time, don't become dry, unfeeling, mechanical. Embrace the halacha of the Kohen with passion and emotion and love and reverence. Take the Levi and combine it with the Kohen, and then you have your Mishkan, your tabernacle, that is dedicated to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Okay, so this is kind of the understanding of the age limits of Kohanim and Levim, the world of emotion versus the world of detailed halachic guidance. These worlds sometimes exist in contradiction, but in point of fact, you have to bring them together. Okay? So, maybe we'll stop here and wish you all a wonderful Shabbos.
Thank you for listening to this Ohr Somayach production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.